We interrupt this program for breaking news from the Global National Newsroom.
Hello, thanks for joining us on TV and on our online platforms. I'm Robin Gill. We're waiting for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to address Canadians on the COVID-19 crisis. We expect the Prime Minister will speak about funding to women's shelters across the country and efforts to support those facing gender-based violence. He'll also face questions in regards to yesterday's news about massive layoffs at Air Canada. We'll get to our correspondence in a moment, but first, here's the COVID-19 picture across the country. About 75,000 people have tested positive for COVID-19 since the outbreak began. The number of people who have been infected is likely higher, but not everyone is tested. And that includes more than 391 new cases reported in Ontario this morning. About 32,000 cases are still active in that province. That's because nearly 37,000 people have recovered. But sadly, there have been more than 5,500 COVID-19 related deaths in this country so far. Let's go to our Mike Drolet in Toronto. Mike, it's the long weekend and lots of people want to travel to their cottages and their cabins. What is the protocol in Ontario right now?
Well, the protocol in Ontario, like in every other province, is sort of up in the air. There's a lot of urging from health officials and from government officials not to travel to non-essential areas, but it's a gray area. So are people not allowed to travel, or they're just urged not to travel? So here in Ontario, for example, Doug Ford has said, please do not travel to these areas up in cottage country and places like Muskoka, where they're worried about, obviously COVID spreading into these rural areas that just don't have the support systems in place. But we are seeing on social media that a lot of people are going up. They're looking at the urge as in, okay, well, you're recommending, well, I'm deciding to go up to the cottage that I own, because as we know, in cottage country, 80% of all the taxes are paid by seasonal cottagers. So they feel that they have a right to go up, and the Premier has said as much, that they have a right to be able to use their places. I have noticed that a number of people have said on social media that they do not feel welcome up there by going into town. And that is a real problem, because the locals, while they rely on these seasonal cottagers to support all their businesses, they do not want them bringing up the COVID. So they're really stuck between two worlds, two trains of thought. Now, in terms of the rest of the country, it's really hit or miss in terms of what you can and can't do. And you really should check your local health officials to be able to double check, to be able to make sure what you can, and if you can go to the cottage. For example, in BC, they are urging people to not travel unless it's essential. It's a little bit more lax in Alberta. They added a little addendum to it saying if there is a small group together, they should not be singing together. I'm not sure why they included that, but Saskatchewan and Manitoba have essentially cut their provinces in half and made the northern parts of their provinces no-go areas. Quebec is a little bit trickier. They have opened up the different areas where people can go from area to area. Again, check your local health officials to be able to know exactly where you can travel. And Atlantic Canada is by far, with the fewest number of COVID cases and fewest number of deaths, is the far more open part of the country at this point, Robin.
Mike, our understanding is the Prime Minister is going to his cottage. Tell us about that.
Well, the Prime Minister is going to his cottage. He has two residences right now. He's using the one residence for his family and the other one for his office. So he's going between the two. And that will obviously get some people up in arms, because they say, well, how is he able to go to the cottage when we're not? Well, one is where his family is living, and the other is his office, and he is the Prime Minister. There was a hubbub a week or so ago around Premier Doug Ford here in Ontario going to his cottage. He drove up early in the morning. This is right after he'd told people not to go. And he had driven up early in the morning to check to make sure that he didn't have any leaks in the plumbing, and was back home by noon. He never stopped anywhere. He went to his cottage, checked it out, came right back to Toronto. But how sensitive people are right now, that's enough to get people worked up. So no doubt people will do the same with Justin Trudeau going from one cottage to the other. But one is where his family's living, the other is where he's working. Okay,
Mike, let's switch topics here. Air Canada announced late yesterday that there are layoffs looking at 22,000 employees. That's on top of the 16,000 that they temporarily laid off back in March. The Prime Minister is obviously going to be asked about a bailout package, but he never wants to go there.
Well, nobody really wants to go there, but realistically, I mean, he's going to have to go there. He's going to have to do something. Some people have pegged the number at $5 billion for what the airline industry in Canada is going to need to be able to survive. Otherwise, it'll crater completely. I mean, you mentioned the 22,800 jobs that are going to be lost next month for Air Canada. They already laid off 16,000 people a few months ago and then rehired them with the government program. But now they're at a position where they've actually lost 95% of all airline travel within Air Canada is lost. So, I mean, that's a lot. They don't really have anybody on their planes right now. And worldwide, we've seen, since the beginning of this pandemic, 4.5 million flights canceled outright. That is a staggering number. And the airline industry worldwide is looking at a $440 billion loss for 2020. They do believe that they can recover by 2023. Whether that means recover as in people will start flying again, or whether or not they'll recoup some of those losses, that remains to be seen. But the reality is that airline industry has been just absolutely decimated. And Justin Trudeau is going to have to address whether or not he's going to have some sort of bailout package ready for the airlines. The government did, not the Justin Trudeau government obviously, but the Canadian government did help Air Canada out after 2001, after 9/11, and again after 2009. Whether or not that's going to, any sort of bailout, any sort of outlay of cash is going to include some sort of concessions, as in executive pay, bailout packages, that sort of thing remains to be seen. But this is something that he's going to have to address, and it's going to have to be in the next couple of months for sure.
Finally, we want to touch on the fact that 5 members of the Canadian Forces tested positive. These are members of the forces that are going into care homes. Tell us about that.
Well, in Quebec, they have 1,400 armed forces service members who are working in 25 long-term care homes. In Ontario, there are 275 armed forces personnel working in, I believe it was 5 long-term care homes. We do know from Theresa Tam that 80% of all the COVID deaths have happened within long-term care homes here and nursing homes here in Canada. So there are a number of personnel that have tested positive for COVID. The government has said that they need to reassess and be able to look at ways to keep their personnel safe and to make sure that anybody who has COVID is not bringing it into the rest of the armed forces, because you don't want it to spread, obviously. That being said, those personnel are still needed because there is a massive need, and as we all know, the health system is pushed to the limits right now, and any sort of help is needed. So once again, they're just going to have to make sure that any cases that are within the armed forces do not spread within other parts of the armed forces.
All right, Mike, we'll get back to you later. We're going to turn now to Keith Baldry. He's the Legislative Bureau Chief for Global BC. Keith, BC schools are going to open June 1st. What's the point at this stage of the game?
That's a good question, Robin. In fact, that's a question a lot of teachers are asking. A lot of teachers are a little fearful of going back into a classroom when their own personal health may be at stake. We don't know everything about this virus in terms of how it behaves. I think, talking to a number of educators, it appears to be this is a dry run for the fall. I mean, the fall in BC, as is the rest of Canada when it comes to schools, it's not going to be a normal situation. Schools are going to be functioning in a far different manner than they have ever in the past. So in British Columbia, as we're going to see in other provinces from varying degrees, it's voluntary on June 1st. You don't have to send your kids back to school. It's purely voluntary. Teachers do have to go back to school, however. And then the classes themselves are going to look radically different. Much smaller classes, basically cut in half of what their usual size is, and only kids from kindergarten to grade 5 will actually be returning to the classroom, and even then only on alternate days. Every second day they'll be going in. Older kids, grades 6 to 12, only going into school 1 day a week in most cases. They'll be continuing their online learning experience that has been there since March. And I think, Robin, that's going to be the model that's going to be used for the fall. We're not going to see all the kids in the school for, you know, the proverbial 9 to 3 o'clock school day. That's out the window. It's much smaller classes, much smaller attendance. And I think that's going to be the new normal going forward.
It's almost like taking the kindergarten model. You know, you only went to school for half a day and your breaks were staggered. You didn't have your recess with the other kids, that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, exactly what it's going to be. There are staggered recesses, staggered lunch hours. The goal, of course, is to keep as few kids as possible in the cluster as long as possible. There's also going to be enhanced sanitation. There's regular hand washing periods now. I know in Europe, some jurisdictions, every hour a bell rings or someone comes on the intercom, and that's the sign that everybody has to line up to wash their hands. And that's going to be, again, this enhanced sanitation protocol is another part of the new normal with our school system. It's going to look radically different. And what BC's doing in June is going to be, I think, replicated in other provinces to varying degrees. It's going to look a little different from province to province, but come the fall, it's not going to be, you know, 800 kids in a high school at any one time. It's going to be far fewer numbers.
Let's talk about real estate. The number of sales have dropped in the two largest markets, Toronto and Vancouver, but the prices haven't.
No, the prices may catch up to what we're seeing here. So 66% decline in Greater Toronto. Overall, across the country, about a 57% drop in sales. It's about 50% in Vancouver, a little less in Ottawa and Winnipeg. But nevertheless, we're talking a hemorrhage of a drop-off when it comes to actual sales of homes. People simply aren't buying right now. But you're right, Robin, the prices haven't really dropped that much. Only about a 1.5% drop in prices across the country. That will vary from location to location. But I think right now, everybody, obviously in the pandemic, a little fearful in terms of spending. There's a lack of consumer confidence, and that extends from, you know, your basic goods that you're buying to making a major purchase, which is the big purchase of your life in terms of buying a home. So the prices haven't dropped, but the demand has dropped. And we'll see where this goes. There's some speculation that international buyers may creep back into the market because their own countries are not safe havens right now for transactions or investments in this pandemic. And Canada may be seen as a safer jurisdiction in which to park your money, and that means parking in real estate.
Let's talk about the NHL. The commissioner, Gary Bettman, is refusing to let the season go. He's determined to hand out a Stanley Cup, and provinces, including BC, have pitched being hubs so that they cut down on that 14-day quarantine travel for players. Yes,
BC Premier John Horgan has actually had an extensive phone call with NHL Commissioner Gary Bettman and his assistant, and talking about just this. And John Horgan has named cities in BC that could host NHL games, not just Vancouver, but over here on the island in Victoria, which has a sort of a junior hockey league arena ready to go, as do places like Kelowna, Cranbrook, Kamloops, and Prince George. Suggesting that pretty well all the NHL games could come to BC. Now, the logistics for this, Robin, as you know, are enormous. Huge hurdles to clear here. All players coming to BC, or any hub city for that matter in Canada, would have to self-quarantine, self-isolate for 14 days. And that's just not the players. That's the whole shebang here, the whole staff, all the trainers, the medical staff, any front office people accompanying them, even the people who drive the buses carrying the players from the hotel where they'd have to sequester for 14 days to the arena. I'm not sure it can be pulled off, but there's a lot of money involved here, and when there's a lot of money involved, that can make the logistics a little easier to accomplish. But it's interesting how much enthusiasm the BC Premier's bringing to this. I know John Horgan's a sports nut. It would be quite something to bring all the NHL teams into British Columbia, even for a short period of time. But there's a lot of conversations going on about this. I wouldn't discount it, but I certainly wouldn't think it's a likelihood of happening.
Well, it would be a small economic boost to any of these hub cities. Let's talk about the border. Any idea when it will reopen?
It seems that no one has an appetite to open this thing. BC Premier John Horgan, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, and Quebec Premier Legault are all very adamant the border cannot open. And now reports out of the U.S. is that the Trump administration doesn't want the border to reopen as well. So there's talk amongst the governments to extend the current closure to June 21st. But I think the border is going to be shut down for quite some time. In Washington State, just to the south of where I am, it's still an alarmingly high number of COVID-19 cases being reported every day. In BC, it's about 15 a day. Washington State, it's almost 400 a day. The deaths in Washington continue to mount. Washington State is 1.5 times the population of British Columbia, yet they have 7 times the number of COVID-19 cases and 7 times the death rate. And you look at Michigan next to Ontario, again, a very serious situation. New York State continues to be a problem. So you've got the 3 largest provinces in Canada saying no to the border opening, and I think you're going to see similar sentiments in the United States. So cross-border travel, not going to happen for a long time.
No, it isn't. Keith, we're going to hang on to you and talk to you in a minute, but let's go to the Prime Minister. He's about to come out, and let's hear what he has to say. I think he's going to talk a lot about Air Canada today. He'll probably talk a bit about how low-income people are affected, and he tends to make a lot of re-announcements of, financing and financial support for Canadians who are struggling through this time. Let's listen in now.
Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. Happy weekend. I want to start by noting that tomorrow is the International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia and Biphobia. Every year, this is a day where we speak out against the stigma, discrimination and violence that target the LGBTQ2 community. We need to show our solidarity tomorrow and every day. Homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia are never okay. We all have a role to play in building a Canada where everyone can be proud of who they are and whom they love. Peu importe où vous vivez ou ce que vous faites dans la vie.
Regardless of who you are or where you live, your life has changed because of this pandemic. Your challenges and your needs are no longer the same because your situation is no longer the same. Our government has implemented new programs to help us to get through this crisis, whether you be studying or retired, with or without a job. At the same time, we are foreseeing more support for programs and organizations whose essential work is even more essential these days.
Health Canada has now approved the first Canadian clinical trials for a potential COVID-19 vaccine at the Canadian Centre for Vaccinology at Dalhousie University. The National Research Council of Canada will be working with the manufacturers so that if these vaccine trials are successful, we can produce and distribute it here at home. Research and development take time and must be done right. But this is encouraging news. A few weeks ago, we announced $40 million for women's shelters and sexual assault centres across the country. And for Indigenous women and children fleeing violence, we're providing $10 million for emergency shelters. Our goal was to help these organizations take all the necessary steps to protect people not only from violence, but from COVID-19. To date, more than 500 women's shelters and sexual assault organizations have received additional support, including Inasmuch House in Hamilton, the Miramichi Emergency Centre for Women, the Saskatoon Interval House, and the South Okanagan Women in Need Society. Les organismes communautaires comme les maisons d'hébergement pour femmes.
Community organizations such as women's shelters are essential for the most vulnerable. During this pandemic, their mission remains unchanged. They are serving a growing clientele, and they need to adapt to the realities and the issues around this pandemic. We have implemented the Emergency Fund for Community Support. There is a funding of $350 million. Most of this funding will be distributed through United Way and Community Associations of Canada and the Red Cross. The eligibility criteria and the details with regards to the registration process will be published on the websites of our partners. The great news is that the organizations that need help will be able to make a request as of Tuesday.
To what we're doing for parents. As you've probably heard, we're boosting the Canada Child Benefit for the month of May. You can expect to receive $300 more per child when you get your benefit this Wednesday. But that's not all. Starting on July 20th, we will increase the Canada Child Benefit once again for the upcoming year. Every summer for the past 3 years, we boosted the CCB to help keep up with the cost of living. And this summer will be no different. As the price of your groceries go up, so will the benefit. On prévoit des mesures de soutien ciblées pour les parents.
We have targeted support measures for parents, such as for students and seniors. We know that these groups are facing specific challenges due to the pandemic. We have a lot of people that we need to help still. I'm thinking of women, business owners who have been disproportionately hit by this pandemic. Many have small and medium-sized businesses and have cash flow issues. Others are working in sectors that have been totally paralyzed, such as hotel services, retail sales, and others. There are additional challenges for women, such as gender-based discrimination. To better support these women, during the crisis, our government will invest $15 million in a women's strategy, Women in Entrepreneurship strategy.
Our number one priority has always been to protect the health and safety of Canadians. And we've been able to count on the Canadian Red Cross to do just that. They've been playing a key role in supporting Canadians during this crisis, helping both individuals and communities with their most pressing needs. But like many organizations, the Red Cross is facing an increased demand for its services at a time where they are getting fewer volunteers and receiving less in donations. So today, our government is investing $100 million to ensure that the Red Cross can keep responding to COVID-19 while also preparing for potential floods and wildfires.
I would like to end this morning by speaking to the youth and children listening to us. I know that the past few weeks have been very hard. You're looking forward to seeing your friends, to going back to school, and yes, to have a break from your parents. For teenagers from the LGBTQ community, it's even more difficult. Oftentimes things are hard at home. And we are all far away from our support networks. We will be there for you. And together, we'll be able to get through this. Things are going to go better. Continue to contribute around the house. Continue to help your parents, because this helps us all. It helps us all to go through this as a society. Hold fast, hang on, and we'll see each other on the other side. Thank you very much, everyone.
One question, one follow-up. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. For questions, star 1. Pour des questions, étoile 1. First question, Teresa Wright, the Canadian Press. Line open.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Over the last several weeks, you have made comments suggesting help for the airline industry was coming. Now Air Canada is laying off more than half its workforce. Will specific help be coming for Air Canada and the airline industry as a whole, and how will it help the workers affected by these layoffs?
We moved forward quickly on support for people who got laid off, and then moved forward on a wage subsidy that has been drawn on by Air Canada and other airlines in order to support people across this country who, because, as you say, the airline industry is extremely affected by COVID-19, there hasn't been the work for them. We're going to continue to work with airlines across this country and make sure that they are drawing on the benefit packages that we put forward for workers through the wage subsidy. But we've also moved forward on a LEAF program for large employers, as well as looking at sectoral supports. We will continue to work directly with big employers across this country and various sectors and make sure that they have the support so we can all come roaring back once this pandemic is through.
And a follow-up, Teresa?
Thank you. You mentioned that Air Canada was using the wage subsidy, but this clearly hasn't been enough to keep employees on the payroll. Uptake on the wage subsidy program has been low overall. What is this telling you about the help that will be needed for businesses over the longer term?
I think one of the things that businesses need is confidence to know that we are going to be there. And just about every day I come out and reassure people that the government will be there to support businesses, to support workers, to support families through this difficult situation. We just announced on Friday that we will be extending the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy until the end of the summer in order to make sure that companies can rehire people, keep them on their payroll, because we know that the best way to bring the economy back quickly and efficiently is if people continue to have that link with their employer, even as we go through the containment measures we have to.
We know that it's a huge challenge for airlines, and this is why we implemented the wage subsidy, and this is why we worked in partnership with other businesses throughout the country to offer support. We know that there remains a lot to be done. We announced the extension of the wage subsidy, and we're going to continue to make sure that people keep a connection with their employer so that we're able to bounce back once the crisis will be over.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Mélanie Marquis, La Presse. À vous.
Thank you. Hello, Mr. Trudeau. The fact that 20,000 people have been laid off at Air Canada, what does this say about the wage subsidy? Should you be doing more? Could the government renationalize Air Canada? The request has been made by the union. We know that this is a very difficult situation for airlines. This is why we've implemented measures throughout the economy in order to support workers, including in the airline industry. We are going to work closely with companies such as Air Canada to see what else we can do.
This pandemic has hit extremely hard on travel industries and on the airlines particularly. That's why we're going to keep working with airlines, including Air Canada, to see how we can help even more than we have with the wage subsidy.
Melanie?
Yes, to come back on this issue of nationalization, are you setting aside this suggestion? Are you looking at a bailout for Air Canada? We're going to work with all kinds of sectors and companies to make sure that they're able to weather the pandemic. We will speak with Air Canada and other airlines to see what are the different options available to support the tens of thousands of employees.
Good morning. The wage subsidy and the bridge loans, they were not enough to prevent Air Canada from planning these major cuts. What does that tell you about the future of this industry in particular and the effectiveness of these programs? And is it possible that some might not survive regardless of government support?
This is a pandemic that has hit extremely hard in all sectors of the economy, and it is something that we are all trying to figure out how to get through the best possible way. But certain sectors have been hit even harder. Obviously, tourism, airlines are the kinds of things that people simply are not drawing on right now. That's why we're going to keep working with various sectors, keep working with specific companies to try and see what the best way through of supporting workers who depend on those industries for their livelihoods, but also look at how we can make sure that Canada comes through this intact and even in a good position for the future.
We're going to continue working with the sectors and the industries that have been hard hit by the pandemic. We will do everything in our power to make sure that Canada is able to weather the storm and and get out of it. And we're going to support workers and families.
To a member of the public that there will not be a bailout for the airline industry coming. Is he right?
We're going to continue to work with sectors and industries to try and support them as they get through this pandemic. We put in place the large enterprise emergency finance facility, LEAF, to be able to support companies with liquidity over this time of the pandemic. It is not a bailout; it is a loan that is going to help them get through. But we are still working with companies to see who's taking that up and how those the format of it will be worked out. Okay.
We've implemented additional credit for large employers. We intend to work with different companies, so perhaps airlines as well, to offer more cash flow during these difficult times. Christian Noël, Radio-Canada. Cities are stuck between a rock and a hard place as they're being asked to help the fight against COVID-19, but their transit systems are not going well. They don't have revenues. They're going to run deficits. Are you aware of this situation? And have you worked with and spoken to the provinces? And will there be assistance? In my 9th virtual meeting with provinces last Thursday, I spoke to this concern that we have with regards to the situation our cities and all our municipalities find themselves in during this crisis. They provide a lot of services and support to citizens, but their revenues have dwindled to in an alarming way. We know that cities are a provincial jurisdiction, and we're not going to get unduly involved, but we will be there to support. We will be there to help the provinces to make sure that the cities remain healthy.
We talked directly about this on Thursday evening in my First Minister's meeting, the 9th of this pandemic, with the premiers, where I highlighted my concerns that Canada's big cities and indeed municipalities of all sizes across the country are facing significant challenges as they continue to deliver services in difficult situations for their citizens, while at the same time seeing massive drops in revenue. We respect, of course, and we know that cities are the responsibility of the provinces, but I highlighted that the federal government is eager to hear from the provinces how we can support cities. It has been very important for me as Prime Minister over these past 5 years to be supportive of our cities, and we're continuing to look to do so, but recognize the provincial jurisdiction in this.
Deux choses en suivi. Un, est-ce que vous êtes en train de dire que l'aide...
So are you saying that the help that might be sent to the cities is slowed down because you're not able to agree with the provinces? And cities need help now. Some people have already laid off municipal employees, such as Edmonton, think they won't have any transit or they'll have to reduce it during the summer. They need emergency assistance now. Number one, are you going to speak with the cities to solve this? Or two, is it possible that there will be assistance for the cities this summer? As we said, we spoke about this and we all agreed. All the prime ministers of the provinces and territories agreed. We need to ensure that there will be assistance for the cities. The federal government will be there as a partner to support provinces in the work that they have to do.
Agree across First Ministers that we need to do more to support cities, and I have assured them that the federal government will be there to support the cities in what they choose to do, what they need to do, to support the provinces in what they need to do to support cities.
Hi, Prime Minister. Crystal Logue with Global News. Beyond the wage subsidy and already announced programs, will there be any industry-specific supports for smaller airlines in Canada that don't meet certain thresholds for support?
We've put in place a support for sectors and large employers, and that is something that we're moving forward on. Industry Canada is engaged closely with various sectors. We recognize that certain areas are harder hit than others. Airlines is a great example of something that was going well before the pandemic, where we are going to need airlines afterwards. We need to make sure we can support them through in the right way that makes sense for Canadians, and that's what we'll do.
But will there be any specific supports for this industry?
As I said, we're working with the industry, we're working with sectors to see what kind of supports would be right, both for Canada and for them.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Mackenzie Gray with CTV. Air Canada right now is losing about $1 million an hour. They lost $1 billion last quarter. They're only flying about 5% of the flights they're using. And now that they're laying off about half their staff and are choosing not to use the wage subsidy. You said before that Canada needs to have a strong airline sector after this. So if that's the case, is the federal government willing to take an equity stake in Air Canada to make sure that they stay alive?
We will have conversations with Air Canada, as we will with airlines across the sector, to try and see how the best way to get through this particular pandemic is. We know that airlines are incredibly hard hit by this pandemic, and we will be there to work with them to see how best we can help.
One of the things that Air Canada mentioned is that, yes, we can get the wage subsidy from the federal government, but the major issue for them financially was the fact that they had to still pay their pension and health benefits out. Is the federal government considering any additional changes to the wage subsidy that would include these programs to allow larger businesses to still keep people employed?
We're going to work with large businesses like Air Canada to ensure that workers, employees, pensioners are protected during this situation. Our focus will always be on supporting Canadians and their families. That's what we're going to talk with industry and companies about. Nous allons toujours nous assurer d'appuyer les Canadiens.
We will always support Canadian workers, retired people. It is our priority. And this is what we will discuss. We're going to discuss this with the different companies asking for support. We will increase the Canada Child Benefit. We know that families are facing additional costs. So as of next Wednesday, you will receive an extra $300 per child through the Canada Child Benefit. In July, as we've been doing for the past 3 years, we will increase the CCB. This will be aligned with the cost of living so that you will have more money to pay for the needs of your family. This is a priority for us to support families, and we will continue to do that.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaking outside Rideau Cottage, taking questions about the government response to the COVID-19 crisis. Let's go back to Mike Drolet and Keith Baldry. The big headline today, obviously, is Air Canada and the layoffs. Mike, what was the Prime Minister's response to all of that?
Well, first off, Keith was talking a lot about the NHL earlier. If you really wanted to see some hockey and some stick handling, this is where you would go, because the Prime Minister clearly did not want to answer any of these questions. I don't know how many times he said, well, there are certain sectors of the economy that are hit harder than others. That was his standard answer to everything when asked about whether or not there was going to be a bailout, whether or not there was possible about nationalization of the airlines. There was even a question at the end about an equity stake, the government taking an equity stake, and every question was answered with, there are certain sectors that are in trouble more than others. Well, we know the airline sector is in trouble, that Air Canada is only getting about 5% of the passengers it did before, that they are going to be laying off 22,000 people, that they are losing almost $1 million an hour. And so, which it's roughly about $22 million a day that they're losing. And the Prime Minister did talk about the loan for large businesses that was available, the $300 million loan. Well, if you do the math on that, that's roughly 13 days before Air Canada, if they are consuming money at the rate that that has been reported is true, that's when they'll run out of that money. So they're going to need another bailout in 13 days. And that's a loan where they're going to have to pay, which they're going to have to pay back anyway. So it's not exactly a bailout. This is a massive problem that he is going to have to address, because to have the airline industry crater, to have it just crash and burn, would just it's a non-starter. We need airlines. It's the way we move around the world. It's the way that business moves. It's the way that we ship goods. it's just a non-starter that is not addressed. And clearly he didn't want to talk about it today. But this is a problem. And also, I mean, we can talk more about this as well, about the small airlines. A number of the small airlines don't even qualify for this loan package because they aren't losing, they don't have the same sort of losses. They're not just as big as Air Canada is. So this is such a huge problem that clearly he either wasn't ready to talk about today or just didn't want to.
But Keith, it's the language that he uses. He says it's not a bailout, this is a loan. We have to talk about all sectors. He can't obviously single out the airline industry alone.
Well, not yet, but Mike's right. The magnitude of this problem cannot be overestimated. This is a huge, huge situation. But the problem I think the federal government has in terms of bailing out Air Canada, there is no end in sight for the airline crisis. It's not like you bail out Air Canada today and fund them for the next 4 months and suddenly the airlines are going to wake up and everybody's going to start flying again. It was interesting, the Prime Minister kept saying, when we're through this, at the end of this. Well, nobody knows when the end is. We could be in this world of hurt right now for a long, long time. There's no reason to assume that we're all going to start traveling with any great fervor or appetite 6 months from now or a year from now or even 2 years from now. Until a vaccine is found and mass distributed and produced, there's a lot of industries that are going to be basically standing down, and a lot of our consumer spending patterns are going to be radically different for the next while until that vaccine is found. So airlines is probably one of the biggest ones in terms of being hurt the most, because I think that's the first thing that goes off the table in most families' budgets is airline travel, because it's probably seen as a luxury. But as Mike pointed out, it's still a vital part of our economy. And it's interesting to see little things though happening, Robin. Here, I just noticed in BC a couple days ago, Harbour Air, which is the sort of float plane service between Vancouver and Victoria, sent out a notice saying it's resuming operations, that they think they've got enough business now, potentially, to start putting planes in the air. And I think what's critical to all this, until a vaccine is found, is it's a psychological thing that people have to start spending money and start consuming things again in a way that we've just basically suspended for the last 2.5 months. Until that changes, you're going to see industries like the airlines just completely crater, and the pressure on the federal government to step in. But at some point, they just aren't going to have an ability to bail out these huge gargantuan industries that up until now have been so vital to our economy.
Mike, what do you make of the future of the airline industry? What's it going to look like?
Well, it's not going to look like it does now, where we have people crammed into planes, herded in like cattle. For the foreseeable future, it's they're going to have people having temperature checks to make sure they're not over 37.6 degrees before getting on. They're going to also, inside the plane is going to be different. People are going to be handed PPE. They're going to be handed gloves, masks, sanitizing wipes. The planes themselves will be cleaned far better than they were before between flights. That includes seatbelt buckles, trays, armrests, and the like. And then when you're in the plane, there's not going to be anybody sitting in the middle row, which anybody who is over 5'4" would say is the most glorious thing that they've ever heard. But I did speak with a travel agent this week who said, was talking about that, saying that's likely the reality that we're going to be looking at. And she said, honestly, we're going to be paying more. If we're going to want to travel, and we're going to want to have these safety protocols put into place, no middle seat is a loss of how many dollars per flight, and you have all those middle seats gone, that's a lot. And so they have to pass on those costs to somebody, so it's going to be more expensive to fly in the future. And it's going to be years before we see the airline industry go back to any sort of normalcy. And even then, I'm sure it's not going to look anywhere like it did just a few months ago.
Keith, is an equity stake an option for the federal government?
Well, I think everything's an option right now. I've been saying since the beginning of this pandemic, don't rule anything out. Everything is a possibility. Governments are doing things right now that were just unfathomable, unthinkable a few months ago. I mean, who would have thought that the Trudeau government would have a deficit approaching $260 billion? In the election campaign, people were getting worked up about whether the deficit was going to be more than $30 billion. So the amount of money flowing out the door right now is just unimaginable. And again, nobody saw this coming in the past. So I wouldn't rule anything out in terms of government response. Having said that, an equity stake seems a bit potentially foolhardy. As Mike says, the airline crisis is going to go on for years. It is not going to be a healthy economic industry anytime soon. So investing in it is really pouring money, a huge amount of money, down the drain potentially. And again, when it does get back on its feet, I mean, the upside is, as Mike points out, we're going to have a much more comfortable situation flying, a much more comfortable experience, far fewer people in the plane. You're not going to be cramped in there next to, elbows with other people for 8 hours or 6 hours. The downside is your cost of your flights is going to be enormous. It's probably going to double, triple, quadruple compared to what today is, because the physical cost of a flight in terms of human resources and fuel isn't going to change, and that dollars have to be counted some way, so it is going to be more expensive. But an equity stake seems a bit of a foolhardy venture for a government. I think right now you look for the government of every level to concentrate on aid programs and not necessarily buying into industries right now which really have no reason to think that they're going to have a healthy economic viability going forward.
But can't you see other industries saying, what about us? Oil and gas, what about us? If you're giving them a bailout, what about us? Mm-hmm. Keith, your analysis of that? I think we've lost him. Mike, let's talk to you about the wage subsidy program. Is that an option for Air Canada employees?
It was an option. It's an option. It depends if Air Canada decides to go along with it. They were using it right now. They hired back. They laid off 16,000 people, then hired them back. Went on the wage subsidy program. That program has been extended through the end of August. But whether or not Air Canada wants to continue with that, because they're still paying other things like into the pension, health plans, that sort of thing, that remains to be seen. There's a lot of money that's going out the door right now, and you were talking about whether or not they want an equity stake or a bailout or how what they're going to be able to do. The reality is that we've never seen this situation before. Think back to 2008, 2009 when the automobile industry cratered. That was deemed incredible. That was deemed like a last resort, and people were jumping, through windows, yelling and screaming that we shouldn't be doing this. Why should taxpayers be subsidizing the auto industry to keep an auto industry alive that is really not that huge anyway? Well, you think about it, the auto industry. It's not just the jobs in Oshawa or Windsor or Woodstock or Cambridge or anything like that. It's all of the secondary and tertiary jobs that are associated with it. Well, the airline industry employs tens of thousands of people directly. Think about all the other jobs that go along with it. This is a huge employer in this country that cannot be overlooked. If you let these airlines go under, there's going to be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people out of work. And that's not something that the government can allow to happen, and especially considering airline travel is not going to go anywhere in general, because we're still going to need to travel elsewhere in the world for business, for pleasure. People are still going to want to go, to Europe or to the Caribbean eventually, not necessarily, this summer, obviously. But we are going to need an airline industry. Are we just going to say that we're not going to have a Canadian airline industry? Because that's really the way we're headed right now, unless, we do the bailout. Then again, the bailout package in Canada has been guessed at maybe $5 billion. If Air Canada is losing $22 million a day, what are all the other airlines losing? And you put it all together, that's a lot of money. And it's a lot of people out of work. And Air Canada has something like 225 planes that are grounded right now that just aren't doing anything, that they're paying money for, and they're paying to park them, but they're not making any money off of them. So this is such a huge, huge, huge deal that is going to have to, the federal government and Justin Trudeau are going to have to get very creative to solve. And they can look at maybe the blueprint from 2008, 2009 with the auto industry, and then quintuple it, or make it to the exponential equation of like 50 or something like that, because it's going to be big. And we've never seen anything like this before, ever.
Keith, there's so much talk about the border and when it will reopen, but it doesn't look like it's going to open anytime soon.
No, I don't think anybody wants the border to reopen. Certainly the premiers of BC, Ontario, and Quebec do not want the border to reopen. The COVID-19 situation in border states right now, still alarming numbers in Washington State, Michigan, New York State. Both the daily transmission cases continue to outpace what we're seeing in Canada, and the fatalities, more alarmingly, also significantly higher than in their neighboring provinces. So right now the border is only open to essential travel, and that's commercial trucks basically. No one else is supposed to be crossing that border point, and I don't think that's going to change for a long time. It's going to be interesting. Right now the Trump administration shows no appetite necessarily for opening the border, although we are in talks with that government to extend the formal border closure to June 21st. Eventually that may become a bit of an election issue in the United States. The election now starts as we hover near the U.S. election. All sorts of issues take on sort of change significance and different shading in terms of political importance. And there's going to be a political calculation made by the Trump administration on the border at some point, but we're still a ways from that. But right now, that border is going to remain shut for quite some time. And I think that's exactly, my understanding is that is exactly the position that BC's John Horgan, Doug Ford in Ontario, and Premier Legault in Quebec make in their weekly phone call with Justin Trudeau. And you heard Justin Trudeau talk about his virtual call to the premiers. That's one issue I'm told comes up as a weekly reminder: do not open that border.
Mike, what's it been like in other parts of the world when they have reopened the border?
Well, we've seen that Singapore was a perfect example. They were really quick to get the whole COVID-19 thing in check and to put in isolation measures, and they had very few cases to begin with because they were on top of it and they acted quickly. But then when they thought they were out of the woods, they started opening universities and businesses, and they allowed flights to come in from Europe and from the United States. And you know, it's like anything. You allow planes to come in with people that you haven't checked or that you don't really know much about, and they bring in the disease, and they bring in the virus, and so then they had a massive second wave. We've seen recently, and this is something that you'll end up seeing people are talking about, because you're seeing a lot of cases in the States where as soon as they make the measures a little bit more lax, people go a little bit crazy. And for example, Wisconsin just a few days ago opened its bars again. The state Democratic governor didn't want to do it, but the Republicans fought it in the courts, and they ended up winning. And so they allowed the bars to open. And what happened? The bars were packed, jam-packed with people who were just out enjoying it. Now, how many of them are asymptomatic cases? They're not really showing anything, but they're carrying it around and then spreading it. You'd have to, based on what we've seen elsewhere in the world, Germany ended up having just a second wave just recently, where they went from 300 cases on Monday to 900 new cases on Wednesday. So they're having a huge blip. So you'd have to think that a second wave is coming to the U.S. based on everything we're seeing down there. Every time that they open up something a little bit more, people flock together and they just act like nothing is going on. So you'd have to think that Trudeau, along with all the premiers across the country, are looking and they're looking at that situation and going, you know what? How about we keep the border closed a little bit longer? Who cares what the Americans want at this point? We have to protect Canada here. If you guys want to go and open everything up, and you have to open your bars, and you want to have your big parties and get ready for summer, fine. But now we're going to see what happens. We're going to see what happens when the second wave hits, and it likely will. But as long as you keep it there, because if they start doing that, if they are just opening it up, and they still don't have it in check, obviously, and those people start wanting to come over the border, they're just going to bring it here, and it'll just be like what happened in Singapore. So hopefully, the Premier and the premiers across the country and the Prime Minister have seen those instances around the world where the planes they've opened things up, and then planes loads of people come in and bring it in, a second wave in, and then they end up having a huge COVID explosion again. Hopefully they're seeing that, and they're learning from those mistakes made around the world, and they're just going to ease off and say, even if the Trump administration wants to open the border, that Trudeau and the Canadian government say, we're going to hold off for a little bit and just see what happens now that you guys have opened a lot of different states.
Keith, the Prime Minister talked about the fact that flood and wildfire season is upon us now too. What kind of pressure does COVID put on those people who are trying to fight those elements in another crisis mode, essentially?
That's a great point. We're about to hit another level of anxiety this summer in floods and wildfires that we've just, again, sort of marrying COVID-19 to what is always a crisis situation with mass flooding and wildfires is an unprecedented situation. It's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out. We've talked to Public Safety Minister Mike Farnworth out here and others about how do you maintain COVID-19 protocols in terms of people working close together when you fight wildfires, and that's something that's a challenge, I think, for all provinces to face. How do you mass sandbag to ward off flooding rivers when you basically have to maintain your COVID-19 protocols of staying far apart from each other, not congregating in crowds? I think public safety measures will probably trump some of the protocols that we've established with COVID-19, but the fact that flooding and wildfires now are on the horizon. I mean, we're sort of approaching biblical plague-like proportions here. You've already got one huge crisis that's shuttered the entire economy of the world, and now you throw on to that some natural disasters, which are very hard to control. Mother Nature is in control here, not the human race, and that's going to be an added challenge and dilemma for, I think, this spring and this summer. It's again, it's always a challenge to fight these floods and wildfires, and just the challenge now has just been magnified by an nth degree because of the COVID-19 problem. It's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out.
And Mike, quite often they call in the Canadian military when we're fighting floods and wildfires, and yet they're fighting on another front in care homes.
Yeah, well, they are. We have 1,400 personnel fighting in Quebec right now. We have another 275 in Ontario. But a lot of those are medical staff. Generally, when you have people going in and helping with the wildfires and with the floods and that, it's more of the frontline soldiers. So there is a little bit of a separation there. So I imagine that if there is a need for the military to come in and help, that they would be available, because there's different branches of the military. A lot of the ones that are in the long-term care homes are a lot of the medics, a lot of the medical personnel, the people who have experience with that, as opposed to, for lack of a better word, the grunts, the people that are out there, the soldiers, the frontline guys that you see, that we see every year with doing sandbags and helping move people around, that sort of thing.
And 5 members of the Canadian Forces did test positive for COVID-19 working in those homes. Tell us about that.
Well, we did have 4 in Quebec, 1 in Ontario, and that's something that obviously makes the Canadian Armed Forces nervous. They don't want any of those soldiers that are in the long-term care homes to be able to go into the rest of the military and spread it. I'd imagine that once they are out of those long-term care homes, that they're put into quarantine. Even if they don't have it, they'll be put into quarantine for 14 days before they're allowed to go back to their bases. That would only make sense. We don't know that for sure. It's just it just seems to be the way that things are going right now. It's clearly something that they are still needed in the long-term care homes, because 80% of all the deaths in Canada have happened in long-term care homes and nursing homes. It is something that has been absolutely horrible, absolutely horrible. We had a case here in just north of Toronto where a nursing home, a sort of long-term care home for disabled people, all the staff walked out because there were too many cases within the unit, and a number of the staff ended up getting it, and they said, forget it, and they walked out, even though they were the ones who brought it in the first place. So those are the type of places where the armed forces are absolutely needed.
Mike, Keith, always a pleasure to talk to you both. You have provided a lot of insight, and we will obviously talk to you again soon. Let's recap what Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said in his address to Canadians. The Prime Minister was grilled on support for the airline industry after news Air Canada is laying off more than half of its staff. We're talking about 22,000 employees on top of the 16,000 that were temporarily laid off back in March. But he won't commit to any sort of bailout, refuses to use the word bailout, instead potentially calling it a loan. Health Canada has approved the first human clinical trial of a vaccine here in Canada. He reminded everyone that research and development does take time, but he said this next step is encouraging news. More than 500 women's shelters have received support from the federal government's $40 million fund announced last month to assist women facing gender-based violence. And the first boost to the Canada Child Benefit will appear on checks sent out this week, an extra $300, and there will be another increase coming in July. And he revealed his government will invest $100 million for the Canadian Red Cross, not just for ongoing efforts to help Canadians during the COVID-19 crisis, but as we get further into flood and wildfire season. And he made special mention of the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia, which is tomorrow. He offered a message of solidarity with the LGBTQ2 community and a call to end discrimination. You can find full details on globalnews.ca and tonight on Global National. And be sure to tune into Global TV Sunday at 7 for our special series, Coronavirus, The New Reality. Thank you for joining us.
This has been a special report from Global News.
Bonjour à tous. I know these are difficult times for many of us. Most families are struggling with increased costs, with kids staying at home and balancing school time while trying to work from home. Je sais que nous traversons une période difficile et la pression.
I know that these are difficult times for all of us, but they are even harder for Canadians and families who must live with this new reality.
Our government acted quickly with the creation of the wage subsidy to help Canadians continue to be employed, and the CERB to help those who have lost their jobs as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're enabling Canadian workers and families to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. But we know that even when families have working members, they're still dealing with increased living costs. That is why we announced a one-time increase to the Canada Child Benefit of $300 per child in May. This payment will be in the bank accounts of Canadians this Wednesday. Today, the Prime Minister also announced that starting on July 20th, the Canada Child Benefit will be increased yet again. This is the third year in a row that the Government of Canada has raised the Canada Child Benefit. This additional tax-free support will help Canadian families pay for things such as healthy food, clothes, and activities they can do together at home. 9 out of 10 families have more money in their pockets as a result of the Canada Child Benefit. Aujourd'hui, le Premier Ministre a annoncé.
Today, the Prime Minister announced that as of July 20th, we will once again increase the Canada Child Benefit.
The government also recognizes that even with the historic investments that we have made, some Canadians are still struggling. That is why we also announced recently the Emergency Community Support Fund in the amount of $350 million in assistance to nonprofits and the charitable sector organizations that support the most vulnerable in our communities. I'm happy to announce today that starting on May 19th, community-based organizations that require financial assistance to reorient their services to vulnerable Canadians during the pandemic will be able to apply for funding through our partner organizations. The Government of Canada is pleased to work hand in hand with the United Way Centraide Canada, the Canadian Red Cross, and the Community Foundations of Canada. Our partners will post information on eligibility criteria and how organizations can apply for this funding on Tuesday, May 19th. While we remain focused on helping Canadians through this pandemic, the Government of Canada also recognizes that there are also additional challenges faced by vulnerable Canadians, including African and Black Canadians. Also, in recognition of Canada's commitment to the United Nations Decade for People of African Descent, I'm also proud to announce that the Government of Canada is moving ahead with the investment of up to $25 million over 4 years in assistance to Black Canadian community organizations, including $5 million in capital assistance. Later this spring, we will share details on how these organizations can apply for grants to build the necessary capacity and infrastructure to better serve Black Canadian communities. We will then work with the Network for the Advancement of Black Canadians, Tropi-Canada Community Services, as well as the Black Business Initiative and Le Groupe 3737 to disperse these investments before the end of 2020. Canadian charities and non-profit organizations have always stepped up to help the most vulnerable in our communities. Even in the most challenging of circumstances, they have continued to help the most vulnerable in our communities. Now is the time for us to help them in return. We have your backs. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. On va maintenant passer la parole à la Ministre Monsef. We'll now hear from Minister Monsef.
Merci. Bonjour, Anin. Salam alaikum to Muslims observing Ramadan. COVID has hit women hardest, with jobs lost, with additional unpaid care responsibilities for their kids or elders. Women are the majority of those on the front lines of the crisis. Personal support workers, childcare workers, food sector workers, nurses and healthcare workers, and social workers. The rates of domestic violence and gender-based violence were high pre-COVID, with a woman being killed by her intimate partner every 6 days in Canada. Because of isolation measures and the pressures people are experiencing, our partners on the front lines are telling us that the rates and the severity of the violence have increased. At the same time, some organizations are telling us that things are eerily quiet, particularly in more rural and isolated regions of our country. Some women are unable to seek help due to increased scrutiny and control and lack of access to friends, extended family, community centers, schools, places of worship. The pandemic doesn't make domestic violence stop. It just silences it. We may not be able to see it, but we know it is happening, making gender-based violence a shadow pandemic. Domestic violence everywhere and always is about inequality of power. When the powerful feel a loss of control, some become depressed, some snap, unleashing frustrations on those around them. Domestic violence is a universal phenomenon. It happens in rich and poor households, in rich and poor nations, in urban, rural, and remote settings. We understand that some women and children may not be aware that support organizations are open and ready to help. To ensure that these organizations are able to continue their critical work at this difficult time, our government announced $50 million to support them. $40 million of this is being delivered through my department, and $10 million is dedicated support for Indigenous organizations and will flow through Indigenous Services Canada. $23 million has been provided to Women's Shelters Canada and the Canadian Women's Foundation, who worked quickly and tirelessly to get money into the bank accounts of frontline organizations. We thank them for this work. Funding began to flow in April, and as of today, I can confirm that 422 women's shelters and 89 sexual assault organizations have received funding. We've reached a separate agreement with the government of Quebec that will see over $6 million in federal funding flow to frontline organizations in the province. Those funds were transferred to Quebec earlier this month. Organizations are using these funds to keep their doors open, pay their staff, purchase cleaning supplies and PPE, laptops and software to support clients remotely, protect workers, and allow for necessary physical distancing measures. As part of the $50 million that was previously announced, $10 million will be distributed to address gaps and support hundreds of other organizations. All eligible organizations will receive funding by early June. I will have more details to share on this in the coming days. So if you're experiencing violence at home, if your home is not a safe home for you or your children, you do not have to stay. I know you're afraid, but there are thousands of smart, caring professionals in every corner of this country who can help. Reach out to one directly or talk to someone you trust to discuss your options and plan your exit. Visit sheltersafe.ca for more resources. If you or someone you know is in immediate danger, call 911 or your local emergency services. There are also people answering crisis lines who can help you, even if you have only a few minutes to talk, including the Kids Helpline at 1-800-668-6868. If you can't speak on the phone, Signal for Help is a simple one-handed signal you can use on a video call. It can help you silently show you need help and want someone to check in with you in a safe way. It's been developed by the Canadian Women's Foundation. Put your thumb to the camera and tuck your thumb and then trap your thumb. If you see someone signaling for help like this, visit the Canadian Women's Foundation website to find out how you can help. Your health and safety is everyone's priority, from the virus and from those who may be threatening you. No one should have to live through violence, whether it be physical, psychological, financial, or sexual. These are difficult times, but the pandemic has also highlighted Canadians' tremendous capacity for social solidarity and shared sacrifice for one another. We will continue to be there for each other. Things will get better. We are deeply grateful to women's organizations and equality-seeking organizations across the country, providing services to vulnerable women and their children. They are providing critical supports, and we will continue to support them so that they can continue to be there for women and children in their hour of need. Merci.
Merci, Madame la Ministre. Thank you, Minister. We'll now hear from Minister Ng. Madame la Ministre.
Thank you. Thank you. Women business owners and entrepreneurs are being uniquely affected by COVID-19 right now. Women are more likely to be represented in sectors being severely affected by this crisis, like in retail, hospitality, and the service industries. Les entreprises sont généralement plus petites et
their businesses are generally smaller and more vulnerable, and it is more difficult for them to seek support.
Most of the unpaid work within the home. And because of COVID-19, many are taking on even more of this work while trying to keep their businesses going. I want to take a moment to speak directly to women entrepreneurs all across our country. I know many of you are wearing so many different hats right now, and at a time that is incredibly challenging and uncertain. I want you to know that we see you, and we're doing everything we can to support you. Every single day, you make vital contributions to our communities and indeed to our Canadian economy. That's why years ago, our government established Canada's first ever women's entrepreneurship strategy. It's a $2 billion investment to increase women's access to funding, to networks, to expertise, so that they can succeed in the Canadian economy. And indeed, this investment actually totals closer to $5 billion when you include government-wide initiatives like financing for women-owned businesses looking to export globally. It is why, amid COVID-19, we're helping entrepreneurs pay their rent, keep their employees, boosting the Canada Child Benefit for parents, and increasing funding to address gender-based violence, and so much more. Aujourd'hui, nous soutenons encore plus les femmes entrepreneurs.
Today, we are supporting women entrepreneurs even more.
$1 million through the Women's Entrepreneurship Ecosystem Fund to provide targeted support to organizations dedicated to helping women business owners. In the coming weeks, this investment will help thousands of women entrepreneurs and business owners navigate through this crisis. It will give women tailored support through things like business workshops, mentorship, and skills training to help adapt to a digital marketplace. Je sais que c'est une période effrayante.
I know that this is a frightening time for many business leaders, especially women leaders.
About getting the support you need and about what comes next. So let me say this clearly. We're here for you, and our work is far from over. We're going to support you every step of the way through this. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Merci, Madame la Ministre. Exceptionally, today we're going to start in the room, Mackenzie, and then we'll go to the phone.
Hi, Minister Hussein. Mackenzie Gray from CTV News. On March 26th, the government closed all the Service Canada centres. Today in Ontario, I can go to the driving range, Home Depot, I can do many things. The province and many other provinces are opening back up. When will Service Canada centres be opened back up?
We took the decision to close the Service Canada centres as a result of an analysis on the importance of employee safety as well as the safety of our clients. However, that has not in any way impacted service. We have redeployed 3,000 staff members to better serve Canadians through COVID-19, and we have a 1,500 agent call center that is taking calls related to Service Canada. We're providing services to Canadians, and in terms of what happens next, you know that the government has issued guidelines on April the 28th on the reopening. It's going to be gradual, and it'll be based on the professional health advice that we get from officials.
To be fair, Minister, I mean, grocery stores have been open this whole time. Many other businesses have had to retrofit during a period. Maybe they closed for a week or two, put up plexiglass, did other things. I mean, Service Canada is responsible for helping Canadians receive the benefits that they really need right now.
And that hasn't stopped.
Oh, I'm not debating that it's stopped, but I mean, I have many journalists. We get calls in our newsroom all the time from people who have limited access to the computer. Maybe they're on the phone and they would prefer to go in person. Why are these places not open now that we've had time to be able to retrofit these spaces and other services in the province are open?
So we made the decision based on the consideration of the safety of the employees, but also of our clients, Canadians who would visit these sites. However, the services are being supplied to Canadians, and in fact we have redeployed staff to make sure that happens. In addition to that, for those who are not able to access the internet, we took proactive measures to not only scale up our ability to take phone calls, but we also went through our outreach and liaison officers and went through trusted community organizations to reach out to the most vulnerable, those who are not able to access the internet, to be able to ensure to them, to assure them that we have a number of means to allow them access to services, including individual agents who are walking people through applications when they are unable to fill them online or even access the phone lines. As I said, we will make those decisions based on the advice of our health officials.
Thank you, Minister. Does our friend from Global have a question? No? Okay. We'll now turn to the phone operator.
Thank you. Merci. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur l'étoile 1 si vous avez une question. La première question de Theresa Wright de la Canadian Press. The first question from Theresa Wright from the Canadian Press. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. This question is for Minister Ng. It's about the Air Canada layoffs. I'm sure that Air Canada and the public will be wondering if a bailout will be offered to this company. The Prime Minister didn't say yes to this, but he also didn't say no. When looking at this situation, is there a concern that offering a bailout for this company could open the floodgates?
Well, I want to thank you for this question. And of course, of utmost concern is helping our companies and our workers through this very difficult time. And you know, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy is certainly there, available for companies to help keep their employees on staff. And we just announced just a few days ago a large enterprise. The acronym is LEAF, but the large enterprise facility that is going to provide, as a last resort, funding support for those companies who may be looking for it. But the work will have to continue, and this period is a really challenging one for Canadian businesses, and that's why we've introduced the many emergency measures that we have to help businesses weather through this difficult period.
Theresa, follow-up?
Yes, thank you. My follow-up question is for Minister Monsef. A number of Indigenous women's organizations told the Commons Committee yesterday that money that has been given to shelters for COVID-19 aid is not reaching Indigenous women, particularly those living off reserve. What will you do to rectify this?
Thank you, Theresa. Minister Bennett and I were on a call with Indigenous leaders from various corners of the country yesterday. We have provided supports to Indigenous women's organizations on reserves, and we are planning on deploying further funds to strengthen the work of those who are working and doing really important work off reserves in urban centers. So more to come on that.
Thank you, Minister. Operator, prochaine question, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you. The next question is from Raisa Patel from CBC. La prochaine question de Raisa Patel de CBC.
Hi there. My question is for Minister Ng. As we've heard, Air Canada plans to lay off more than half of its workforce. It did use the wage subsidy, and it would have had access to bridge loans. What does this latest update tell you about the effectiveness of these programs?
Well, I think that that this is absolutely a challenging time. We've certainly heard it from many businesses of all sizes across the country. And the measures that we have put out is indeed to help our businesses weather through this very difficult and challenging period. So whether it is to help them keep their employees through the wage subsidy or helping with lending products for the small businesses, but businesses indeed of all sizes, including large businesses like that of Air Canada. We know that sectors, particularly like tourism, have been particularly hard hit as a result of COVID-19. This is work that we are going to have to continue to do to support our workers and to support our Canadian companies through this very difficult time. And that work doesn't stop; it continues.
Follow up.
But regardless of these measures, Air Canada is still engaging in layoffs. Do you foresee some businesses not surviving this crisis regardless of government support?
Well, I think throughout this period, our focus has absolutely been on helping our Canadians, helping workers, helping businesses manage through this period. This period has been particularly difficult for some for some sectors, as I mentioned, in tourism. We're going to have to keep doing the work that we have been with Canadian businesses to weather through this period, so that we can come out of COVID-19.
Thank you, Minister. Seems like some of your colleagues are enjoying the long weekend. So, Mackenzie, back to you.
Mr. Ng, it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, generally that when a company of this size lays off this number of people, they have to inform the federal government that there are going to be layoffs of this size. Has Air Canada done that in this case, or did they give you a heads up prior to it becoming public?
Well, I'm not aware of that, but I would say that what is available to Air Canada, as well as companies of all sizes and in all sectors across the country, is the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, where employers can indeed keep their employees on staff. And keeping employers and employees together is something that's really important. We want our workers to be supported. We also want to, make sure that companies are getting the help that they need through this time. We've also extended the wage subsidy support, so that will go until August. And we're going to have to keep doing the work to ensure that our companies of all sizes are supported through this difficult period.
And the Prime Minister have both mentioned the need for workers to stay with their companies. If federal funds are given to Air Canada, will it be on the condition, or any other business for that matter, that they rehire the employees that they have laid off?
Well, the conditions that we have put out, particularly for the wage subsidy, has to do with revenue decline. So if you're seeing revenue decline, you absolutely will, will get access to the wage subsidy. And in the large enterprise facility, there are conditions with respect to that facility that that ensures that Canadian taxpayers are indeed considered and in the course of those considerations.
My final question for you. Right now, if you have had a flight with Air Canada or any of the other airlines that has been canceled, they're not giving you a refund back. They're either giving you a credit or pushing your flight forward. With many of the airlines having major financial issues right now, do you think the Canadians should get their money back right now, or should they have confidence that these airlines will be around to actually honor their flights whenever we'll be out of this and planes will be able to take off?
Well, Air Canada has been has been and continues to be a good Canadian corporation, and we hope that Air Canada will treat its customers in the way that they always have, and I'm hopeful that they, of course, will ensure that they are serving their customers well.
Thank you, Minister. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. That's it for today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. The conference is now ended. Please disconnect your lines at this time.